Alright, here we go with segment 2 for Wednesday, and we're going to continue on with imperialism. What is it? Why does it occur in the 1890s? And so forth. So, our definition is, of course, that it's the expansion at the expense of other people's cultures or economies. And from that definition, you can probably take that it sounds in many ways to be negative by our standards today. But you have to recall the general tenor of the times back at the turn of the century, and this was something that went along very well with social Darwinism, as well as the fact that it was taking place in many other areas as well. So many people in the United States see this as the logical expansion of the Western movement. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that the United States had always had a frontier, and this actually will bring us to the frontier thesis in a minute. But with the West filling in, moving outside of our borders and moving to other areas if we can, seemed to make logical sense. There was also the temptation to exploit weak neighbors nearby, and there were quite a few. And of course, the desire of American businesses to open markets abroad, which would definitely be part of imperialism. We've seen the beginnings already. We talked about the Mexican intervention, purchase of Alaska, and CSS Alabama claims. By the 1890s, the U.S. is more focused on and reacts to foreign policy issues that it never would have really either dealt with or thought about in the past. During the 1890s, the United States almost goes to war with Germany over the island of Samoa in the Pacific, as the two are struggling to figure out who gets to use the island as a coaling station. Naval vessels ran on coal at this point, and having an island or locations throughout the Pacific where you could actually store your coal and refuel your ships was very important. Other nations are in the Pacific as well. The United States almost gets into a scrape with Italy over the same basic idea. And as we'll see, by 1900, Teddy Roosevelt, who will become president in 1901, states that the U.S. has the right to step in wherever chronic wrongdoing is detected. Of course, this is in our hemisphere, and he's going to bring the Monroe Doctrine back when it comes to our hemisphere, and instead of using the portion of it that seemed to indicate that we thought that the nations in our hemisphere should not be invaded, he used it in a different way to make us, as you can see in this very well-known cartoon, the police force of this hemisphere. We'll talk more about that when Roosevelt gets into office. So the history of our view towards the rest of the world, of course, we have a very strong sense of isolationism. We've had the buffer zones of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean between us and any real major forces that could threaten us in any true way. We've talked already about the American way of war, the notion of not being very militaristic until it's time for war, and then building up once war, in a sense, has already started, and then actually doing relatively well, although because we demilitarize between wars, we often do not do well in our first battles. And again, we demilitarize because having a standing army is expensive. You have to use taxes to pay for it. They have a tendency to try and take over the government. So instead we have the tradition of the citizen soldier, and you see the statue of George Washington there as Cincinnatus, the idea that when it's necessary to pick up the sword or the gun, then our leadership and our people will do it, but then after a war is over, we'll turn those back in and become farmers or become normal citizens again. And so this is sort of our traditional history when it comes to the military. So not being attacked and taking up arms and spreading across the world is something that's a little bit different from what we had done in the past. So why do we do this in the 1890s? Well, some see it as a response to the problems of industrialization. We need new markets. We had the Panic of 1893, and getting new markets would give us new places to sell our products. It would also bring us new resources and new customers. Another thing is that as we spread, it would give new areas for people to move to relieve some of the overcrowding that was seen in the cities. It is in the 1890s, in fact 1890 itself, that the historian Frederick Jackson Turner first published his frontier thesis, with his idea that the United States had been filled in And as a consequence, we had lost the frontier, which had had such a huge impact on our history. Part of what Turner pointed out, which we talked about before, was the move on down the road idea, and that if people were unhappy, they always had the frontier to go to in order to avoid whatever it was that was happening that they didn't like. And because of that, we didn't have people who were forced to stay together, become angry, and then have revolutions the way they had in Europe. Well, according to Turner, what you see in the labor strife, for instance, in the big cities in the United States, was the result of the fact that the frontier had disappeared. So now we were beginning to have European-type problems. And so his argument was we needed a safety valve, a new frontier for people to go to in order to get away if they didn't like what was happening, and that would keep us from becoming like the Europeans. So this made sort of a theoretical argument for why we needed to expand. Another reason why we would expand was because we could. This is the social Darwinism argument that if your nation is virile and successful enough to take over others, then you should, because it's very much like evolution, and again, the connection to God in that sense. It's also true that the rest of the world was being carved up in global imperialism, and that's a pretty important point. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And beyond that, Britain was no longer as dominant as they once had been, so there's new avenues for the U.S. to perhaps get involved in. And finally, there was a sense that morally this was something along the lines of the white man's burden, and I believe most of you have studied this notion before. This cartoon you're looking at is actually a cartoon about the white man's burden, and you can see that those holding the burden were John Bull representing the British, and of course Uncle Sam representing the United States, and the burden they're carrying are minority groups, at least from our perspective. In reality, it was groups that were not as industrialized. So, in a sense, it was the white man's burden to spread the goodness of the cultures that they had developed to everyone else, which, yes, if it sounds a little bit like the Protestant ideas back in the early colonial period, it should, because there's a direct theoretical line between the two. Here's global imperialism, and you can take a look, as you're probably familiar with from last year, at the way Africa is split up during this period of time. It seemed that if you were a strong European nation, you would go into Africa and create colonies. It was interesting that Otto von Bismarck, who took over or became the leader of Germany in 1890, when he was asked why the Germans needed, for instance, German East Africa that you see there, his argument was basically because everybody else is doing it, and if you don't, you might miss something. So many of the industrialized nations were busy creating empires and being imperialistic. And of course you can see that Asia was being chopped up as well in many ways, with, in the minds of many people in the West, the big prize in Asia being China, and we will definitely discuss that a little later. So, if we have a why we need to do it, and when, because the time was right, the question is how do we do it? And the answer to this came from a book written by an author named, a historian named Alfred Thayer Mahan. His book was called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And it took about 400 pages. He wrote about the history of the British Empire, and really his bottom line thesis was, how were the British so powerful? How could two little islands control much of the earth? And the answer was they had a big navy. The United States will actually take this to heart, begin to build a navy starting in the late 1880s, and by the time Teddy Roosevelt becomes the president, he will have that navy to use as, some people will call it, his big stick for big stick diplomacy. Not just in the Caribbean, but definitely in the Americas and sometimes elsewhere. So now the question is, who's behind it? Who would like to have the United States do this thing that it had never really done before? Well, the group behind this was a group called the Foreign Policy Elite. Now, interestingly enough, there's still a group of people who probably fit this category today. And in reality, these are people who are obviously American citizens, but because of what they do and because of what their lives focus on, they tend to focus on foreign policy. So most Americans are too busy doing their own thing and focusing on the narrow constraints of their lives to pay that much attention to foreign policy. That's true then, it's true now. And so this tends to include business and governmental people who are involved in foreign policy. If your business deals with overseas trade, then you're very focused on foreign policy. And of course, the government under the Constitution is required to deal with foreign policy. But both of these groups will see new markets and, of course, spreading the American way of life as something that would be very positive. Now, of course, we put that in parentheses, whether those other people would like it or not. So two of the people that you see here are really strong catalysts for some of the major events in imperialism, and they are Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who are part of the media at the time. They are big newspaper magnates. And what they'll find is that when the United States gets involved in war and things along that nature, that their newspapers will sell dramatically. So they'll push for events a little bit along these lines, and in some cases maybe even fabricate them or create them in order to get readership for their newspapers, which makes them more money. But the foreign policy elite are those who have the time to pay attention to it, are interested in it, or might find some way to benefit from it. And they are the people who were behind a lot of the moves that will be imperialism. Now, there were those who were against it, the anti-imperialist, and of course their general ideas came from our history as a colony and how we shouldn't behave like the British had behaved towards us. Now, there were those who were in the U.S. that worried that taking over new areas would bring in immigrants that would create all kinds of problems and try to, and perhaps even diffuse our culture. There was, of course, the pragmatic fear of the problems that owning things far away would bring us, like the fact that we'd have to protect them and that we might end up getting dragged into war because of it. Interestingly, you could make the argument that the United States taking the Hawaiian Islands in 1898 actually will set up us getting into war, and it definitely will, but in 1941 when the Japanese attack Hawaii. But the cost of maintaining them, the cost of defending them, and the chance that somebody else might try to take them from you, and the responsibilities that are all part of owning colonies were some of the things that the anti-imperialists were focused on. And you see in the map here the locations that the United States will take, beginning with Alaska in 1867 and then moving forward to 1899, as you see the U.S. gets involved in taking the Philippines and Samoa, etc. These are areas that will eventually have to be defended by the United States, so that's the responsibility part of it. The truth is that the anti-imperialist impulse was relatively small. There were isolationists, but we'll see that the pro-imperialists definitely get the upper hand. Now let's get to the examples of imperialism. And we'll start with the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Hawaii itself was not really interested in being annexed by someone, but the United States, just by sending a few ships there, will be able to overwhelm any kind of defense that the Hawaiians might have wanted to put up, but they don't actually fight at all. Interestingly, the real push to pick up Hawaii came from the Dole pineapple family that was using the pineapple plantations in Hawaii, and the fact that they were angry at Queen Liliuokalani for raising tax rates, and they pushed very hard through bribery and through coercion to get the Congress to support the notion of the United States taking Hawaii. There was also a sense that if the U.S. didn't take it, somebody else would take it first, and this is one of the other reasons for imperialism to end up being the way that it was, and the time that it was, because the U.S. felt that, hey, if somebody's going to take over an area, we ought to do it because we'll treat the people better than perhaps somebody else would. But the annexation of Hawaii, which occurs in 1898, was actually part of McKinley's 1896 presidential platform, and so it wasn't a big surprise that the U.S. took over the islands at that point. They'll be a territory, of course, until they become a state in 1959. Now, our other example is actually a very interesting one, the Venezuelan boundary dispute, and we'll go ahead and finish up with this example since we have we're getting close to 15 minutes on this segment. But you'll notice in the map that Venezuela is located, at that time, was located next to a British colony called British Guiana, and you can see where it's located in the northern portion of South America. While Grover Cleveland was president, gold was found in a disputed area between Venezuela and Guyana. The British, of course, came up with a map that had the red line that you see there, claiming, in essence, all the gold belonged to them. And, of course, the Venezuelans came up with a map that showed